Solve by completing the square. Our first step, when you're trying to solve 2x squared minus 8x plus 15 equals 0 by completing the square, is to move the constant to the other side of the equation. So now we have 2x squared minus 8x equals negative 15. Our next step is to group our x's. Our next step, which we haven't done yet, is to factor out the leading coefficient. When you factor out this 2, make sure that you factor it out of everything that's inside the parentheses. So if I factor out the 2, I should still have the x squared and the minus, and 2 factored out of 8. What you're asking is 2 times what number is 8x, and that would be 4x. And notice I'm still doing this in black. Is equal to negative 15. Our next step is to try and get the exponent 2 on the outside of the parentheses. And this 2 will stay there. We bring down the x, we bring down the minus, and here's where I change the color. Now is when I take half of this other coefficient. It doesn't matter that I factored the 2 out of the 8. That's not the step I'm working on currently down here. This step says take half of the coefficient of the non-squared variable. So now I have half of 4 is 2. But recall, this really is no longer equal to negative 15. This is where you need to be very careful. And we need to square this negative 2, which is positive 4, multiply it by the leading coefficient, which is 2, and add that to the other side of the equation. So 2 squared was 4, and 4 times 2 is 8. We now have 2 times x minus 2, the quantity squared, is equal to negative 7. So now I'm ready to solve for x, to get x alone. I need to get rid of the furthest thing first. And the furthest thing is not the exponent, but it is this coefficient. So to get rid of this 2 that's being multiplied to the problem, I can multiply by 1/2 on both sides of the equation. We now have x minus 2, the quantity squared, is equal to negative 7/2. The furthest thing from x now is the exponent, so I take the square root of both sides. But when I take the square root, I write plus or minus. We now have x minus 2 is equal to I times the square root of 7/2. If you'll recall, in our last chapter we worked with radicals, and we never left radicals in the denominator. So if I multiply both the denominator and the numerator by 2, and that's being multiplied, we have 7 times 2 is 14, still inside the radical. 2 times 2 is 4, but the square root of 4 is just 2. So we have one more step to try to get x alone. If we add 2 to both sides of the equation, we'll have our final answer. X is equal to 2 plus or minus I square roots of 14 divided by 2. Unless, of course, you want to get a common denominator and write this as one fraction. So putting a 2 both in the denominator and the numerator, we could write this answer, x is equal to 4 plus or minus I square roots of 14 all over 2. So be careful not to continue with your fraction bar if the other number is not a fraction. And I hope you notice where I got this I from. We had the square root of a negative number, and that's where the I came from.